From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Many of us, or most of us, can't remember when we first learned about the Statue of Liberty. It's been part of our knowledge from way back in our childhood somewhere. And we know a little bit about it. We know it is an icon of liberty that stands in New York, and it was a gift from the French people. Most of us have either visited the Statue of Liberty or certainly would like to. But Liberty's torch brings us on an intellectual journey back to explore the times, the people, and the challenges in planting this iconic symbol of freedom in the heart of our nation. So it's with great pleasure, and please welcome Elizabeth Mitchell.
Hello. I can't tell you how excited I am to be here. This is an amazing event, and it's inspired me as a reader and a writer. And so anyhow, thank you for having me. I wanted to talk about how I originally came to this story, because I think it's maybe how you might have come to the story as well. I had always thought that the Statue of Liberty was simply a gift from the French government to the US government. It certainly was an icon that had become incredibly important to the country, but I thought that that was the origin. So one day I was in the New York Public Library Manuscript Division, and I was sort of looking for something else, and I saw that they held the diary from when Bartholdi, Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, who was the artist who created the Statue of Liberty, it was from 1871 and his first trip to America. So I thought I'd take a look. And when I was reading through this, I realized that this was not a man who came here representing a government. He came here as an individual who just had this idea and this dream to create a colossus. And he was coming to a country where he knew no one really, and he was pitching it cold. And that to me sounded like one of the biggest adventures that anyone could go on. So I started looking into the story, and it truly held its suspense for me through the whole investigation. So we'll first start with, who was Frederick Auguste Bartholdi. He was from a little town in the northeastern part of France called Colmar. It's a fairly small town, and he was a middle-tier artist by the time he was pitching the Statue of Liberty. But he grew up in this town that was somewhat of a storybook town, and that photo is actually from just a year ago. It still looks like that. It's this sort of a town that, in fact, was used very frequently in children's book illustrations of the period because it had such a sort of lovely, homey quality to it. He grew up there with these two parents who were very much in love with each other. But when he was 2 years old, his father suddenly died, and his mother was faced with how to raise both him and his older brother, Charles, and how to make them thrive in the world. She knew that they would have a nice life in Colmar, but they would never be truly heroic in the way she hoped for them. So she decided that she was going to move them to Paris. Now, Paris was not, and this is actually their house in Colmar. They have, that's the courtyard, and that's one of his pieces in the courtyard. But they moved to Paris, and Paris was not, the Paris we know now. It was constantly being riddled with revolutions. There was squalor, in whole parts of the city, and she didn't really know much of what was going to happen to them, but she did know that she wanted them to have educations, the best that she could find. And so part of that education was bringing her sons to some of the artists of the day for tutelage and sculpture and drawing and all the rest. And both sons showed promise. But one went on to study law, that's Charles, but her son, Frederick, decided that he wanted to be a sculptor. And so at the tender age of 19, he got a commission to build this statue to one of the war heroes of Colmar, and really his mother got him the gig. She did everything possible to get him the job, and in fact, he went and reported in Paris to tell the authorities who were making the decision that it's already been decided that he would get that job. So he did this statue, and he made it. He knew that it was going to be headed to the Paris Exposition of 1855, and he made it just a couple of inches too big to go in the exhibition hall. So it had to be outside of the hall, and as a result, it received a lot of attention and also a lot of jealousy from his colleagues. But it also was enough to get him a third-place medal in that salon, and that gave him a little bit of prestige. And with that prestige, he hooked up with another artist who was more established, and they decided to go to Egypt. Egypt was exotic, but it was not quite as exotic as we would maybe think now, because there were such strong relations between Egypt and France. And there had been some artists and poets who had gone and traveled and photographed the area. But Bartholdi was going to be one of the first people to actually photograph Egyptian life and the Egyptian statues. He didn't know much about photography, but he taught himself for this trip, and they headed out. And as you can see, they became very enamored with the culture and decided to try and, as they said, go native. And so they got a boat, and they went up the Nile, and they were in these would often dress in this fashion. But the thing that really was important about this trip was that Bartholdi came away completely impressed by the sphinxes and pyramids that he saw, this idea that there could be something that could last for eternity. And this was very important to him. I think that not only from the loss of his father at that early age, but also there had actually been another Frederick Auguste Bartholdi born to that family before he was born. That child died and after just some months of life, and he was the replacement figure, but he knew that he was in that role. And he also knew that France was always in the state of turmoil, and so these statues that were in Egypt that looked as if they could last for the rest of time that we can imagine were very impressive to him. The other thing that was very impressive was that there was the beginnings of the creation of the Suez Canal, and that was a truly wild idea, as wild as creating a colossus for a country you've never been to. It was going to make the canal through the desert so that you could link the two seas, and so the travel from Europe to Asia would be reduced by 2.5 months, and certainly a great deal of the sort of threat of death would be taken out of it. And when Bartholdi went to Egypt that first time, on the boat there was Ferdinand de Lesseps, the visionary who was going to make this thing happen. So Bartholdi, being a bit of a visionary himself too, decided that he wanted to create a colossus, and this is an artist's version of the Colossus of Rhodes, and he wanted to create that colossus for Egypt. So this is an actual first rendition of his idea of the statue for the Suez Canal in Egypt. And it looks to me very much like the Statue of Liberty. So he pitched that idea, and the kind of funny thing is when you look at the account of him presenting the statue, it looks as if what made the Khedive of Egypt reject the idea was that it was a little bit too old-fashioned. So Bartholdi instead, some time goes by, the Franco-Prussian War erupts, he's swept into that, and then right after that is what's called Bloody Week in France, which was when the Communards fought against the Versailles government, and there were 10,000 bodies left in the street. And in that setting, Bartholdi started to think that first of all, he knew he needed to get out of France. His part of France, Colmar, had been given away to the German government in the peace treaty, but also Paris had just been riddled by Bloody Week, and there was no sense that if you were a statue maker, there was no way you were going to get a job at that point in France. And so he decides he's going to set off for America. It's right in that very time period. So he revamps his Egypt idea, which you have over on that side, to be more like this. And he comes to America. Now this is a photo, and it's a little bit earlier than when Bartholdi was coming, but only by a few years. And that's 28th and Fifth Avenue. And so this is what New York was, looked like at the time. And and when he came in, he was just struck by the sort of pell-mell nature of the visuals of the place. And he really only had these letters of introduction. He goes around and tries to say to people, I have this idea. I'm going to build this massive woman in your harbor. What do you say? And no one was interested. He has very funny accounts of the meeting with glacial interest and him hurrying to pack up his things and leave. So anyhow, he went up and down the East Coast. He came to Washington, and he has very funny things to say about that, too. He was not a big fan of Washington. He saw the Washington Monument built up to 70 feet at this stump, and he thought, this is going to be the ugliest thing that's ever existed. And even later on, when he comes back years later and it's built higher, he says it just ruins the city, and he goes on about that. So anyhow, he does get a little bit of support from Ulysses S. Grant, who says, well, he's president at the time, he's on vacation, Bartholdi stops by, they have cigars on the porch, and he said, if you want to give us this statue, we could probably find a home for it. So Bartholdi thinks, this is it, I've got a deal. And he decides that's as good as he's going to get, basically, on the East Coast, and he sets off across the country, to see everything he can of America. And that's a truly amazing thing, and one of the things that really brought me into the research in this book, because he is a beautiful writer. He sees incredible details. He saw America at this moment in history where it was shifting, where there were still soldiers marching home from the Civil War. There were women fighting for the right to vote out west. He goes to Chinatown in San Francisco. He goes to see the redwoods. It's really an amazing account. But out there, he started to love America. He was not a huge fan beforehand, but out there, he started to see what was great about the country. So this is actually this is one of his first photos of him with his assistant, who's apparently, by all accounts, a lovely man who just, like Enkidu and Gilgamesh, they traveled together, and he supported him and everything. But here they are at Niagara Falls, which before all the fencing and all that. So he doesn't get a lot of enthusiasm in America, but he feels in his heart that he's got a great idea and he's going to make it happen. So he goes back to France and he tells the French, essentially, they love the idea. The Americans, they're all for it. Let's get going. So he hooks up with Mondui's forge, which they did all of the sort of monumental work for Notre Dame when it was being renovated, and there was a great deal of work being done in Paris because Haussmann was sort of redesigning the whole city. He is aligned with them, and he has a fundraiser in France. And the first fundraiser, with the people thinking that America is really excited about this, is quite a success. There's 200 powerful Frenchmen attending, and it looks like he will do very well. But that soon starts to peter out. He realizes that the best he can do is raise enough money to build the hand and the torch and send that to the 1876 Philly Expo, which was going to be the first world exposition held in America. And so that would be 1876. It was going to be the 100th anniversary of the country, and this would ignite, again, this great enthusiasm. So they start to build it. Now, the only problem was that he had to leave at the beginning of May to go to the expo. He was a judge, in fact, for the French government at the expo. But as they are going to move the torch, the plaster cast and the wood cast that are to be made into this copper version, it falls and breaks into millions of pieces. And so the whole thing has to start from the beginning. So he's down, he goes to America, he's in quite a state, and he attends the expo, but he does not have the torch, and he wanted it for the 4th of July in particular. Finally, at the very end of the expo, it arrives, but there's only a month left, and it gets enthusiasm, and people are buying tickets to go up into the torch, but it is not enough time to generate the kind of feeling he wanted. So he moves it. He gets various officials in New York to say it can go to Madison Square Park in Manhattan. But there he notices something very interesting, which is that when it was down here in Philadelphia, even for that month, people were fairly excited about it. They could climb up, they could look around. In New York, there's no access, and pretty soon people just start walking around as if there was nothing there. It blends into the scenery over time. And so he realizes that, it's all well and fine to get people excited about the notion of liberty and this relationship between France and America, but what really people want is entertainment. And so he goes back to Paris, and he creates something called a diorama, that was the entertainment of the day, all the rage. You would walk into a room, and all of a sudden you would feel that the seasons changed in an instant, or you were having dinner with, Caesar or something. And he creates one of New York Harbor, and this was a sensation. The journalists who went to it could not get over the fact that you walk there and the wind is blowing at you and you hear people talking Yankee fashion, and you see the Statue of Liberty standing in this harbor. And so he sold a lot of tickets to that, and that was a big part of the fundraising for the Statue of Liberty. Then he decides that he's going to unveil even something more compelling for the people, and this is the head for the Paris Expo. When it came through Paris, he decided to unveil it a little after the expo began, so that there could be this amazing moment where this head that is, big enough, as someone said, to hold on a cart big enough to hold the Pantheon, it rolls through the streets where all of the mayhem had unfolded over all the years, and people start singing the Marseillaise, and they're crying and cheering, and it comes to rest in the park, and he sets up his little kiosk there, and he was not allowed to charge tickets there because it was part of the Paris Expo, but instead he said, if you want to go up into the crown, you have to buy this postcard of New York Harbor, and then you can go up. So again, he raises money in that way, and this also excited people to say, we want to see the rest of this being created. So he started, let me just say one thing. This is a question of who is the face of the statue, because when that first was unveiled, there was a lot of controversy about what who that person could be. There's a legend that says that it's his mother. But the thing is, he never confirmed that, and this is a man who was very dedicated to pushing the great line that would hook people. And he also, if you look at the face of the mother, she has these arched brows, the bone of the brow is arched. She has a very thin mouth and this kind of extremely narrow nose. And since he never confirmed it, it made me wonder if that truly was who it was modeled after. He did tend to put his loved ones in his work, so that would make sense. But there's the face as it was when it was first brought to America. I actually think it's his brother, and that's because his brother, if I were able to do that enlarging thing, you would be able to see clearer, but the features are very similar, and his brother was someone extremely important to him because he had been his idol when he was younger. He was an extremely intelligent man and had studied the law and was a great artist before Bartholdi was an artist. But he actually went mad, and it was an incredible family tragedy, and Auguste Bartholdi was the one who had to bring him and put him in the sanitarium, and then he would go visit him basically weekly, and he would bring him little things, like it says, he brought him a cello, he brought him a ball, a little dog, and all these things trying to bring his brother out, and nothing would reach him. And so he spent a tremendous amount of time sitting there looking at his brother in this sort of almost catatonic state, and I think that he actually was trying to commemorate his brother in the statue. When it was brought up who was the face of the statue, he got choked up but wouldn't say anything. It makes me think it's the brother. But in any case, he started to create more of the statue, and this is an amazing picture with the shoulder there in the background, lurking. He had 50 people working on it at one time. This is actually him near the scaffolding of the hand. They would lay the plaster over, and then they would put the copper over that, and it was this extraordinary process to get it made. But they started to actually construct it in the streets of Paris, in this neighborhood, and that must have been a really amazing thing to see. That in your residential neighborhood, suddenly there's this 151-foot woman standing there, and so he knew too that would make people excited, and so he would charge for people to come in and go all the way up to the top, and that was a very, very popular thing to do on the weekends, in particular in Paris. And he even left it up longer than he needed to, just so that he could get more money that way. So anyhow, there's another picture of it going up. But now this begs the question. So he's got this statue. It's done, basically, as of 1885, the very beginning of the year. And then what's America doing? So it turns out nothing. So he has this statue, and there's nothing going on. There's no pedestal. They don't have any money for a pedestal. And so there are some wild letters back and forth saying, what are you thinking? I have to get this out of here, and you need to accept it. So anyhow, back in New York, there's, there's one man, Richard Butler, who was basically became Bartholdi's great friend, and he was a rubber magnet, and he was trying to do what he could, but he didn't have much power. So they would run things in the newspaper, and no one would be interested in raising money for the pedestal. So you have Charles Stone, General Charles Stone, who had been a Civil War hero, who had then been disgraced, had ended up in prison as a traitor, and he felt absolutely wrongly imprisoned. And he had gone away to Egypt for a period of time to work in Egypt and came back to America and was given the job to be the engineer of the pedestal and putting the statue in place. And he was, he would be darned if he was going to let this thing flounder. So he had a lot of motivation to get it done. They also had all of these workers, many of them who had worked on the Brooklyn Bridge, standing by, ready to work, but still not enough money to do anything. They started to get enough to build partially, but the work stopped right about there and on the pedestal, and no money to clad the pedestal or anything like that. So what did they need? They needed Joseph Pulitzer. Pulitzer was this incredible guy he was a Hungarian immigrant, had come over, didn't speak any English, slept on park benches, had all kinds of adventures, but went out west to the Midwest, and he was a reporter, and he was a muckraking reporter, and he would do everything to take down the robber barons and cause whatever mayhem he could for the wealthy. So he decided he was going to come to New York, and he wanted a newspaper business in New York. He bought this down and out newspaper with hardly any circulation, and he said, this is going to be the people's paper, it's going to be us against the rich man, and he started forth. It started to get some momentum, but still it wasn't a huge, huge success. And he saw the head of the Statue of Liberty in Paris, and he said, you know what, if the rich people aren't going to do it, it's going to be the little people who will get it done. So he said, if you give even a penny to this effort, I will put your name in the paper, and we will celebrate this, and we will raise the money. The other thing is that raised circulation, because people would want the paper that had their name in it, and their friends would want that too. So it became a very big success for all concerned. So then the statue came to America. They were able to start putting it in place. You'll see this is an amazing thing that the Americans worked without a scaffold, so they would just hang down the statue on ropes, and even the French thought that was crazy. But they got it made. And then this was the inaugural. And when it came time for the inauguration of the statue, it was a huge celebration, partially because just 2 days before, the city had been given the day off. And so everyone flocked for a parade that was 30,000 people marching in the streets. They had a naval parade. They had, they would have in a few days fireworks going off. But it was a very foggy and rainy day, so that not everyone could see the statue when the unveiling happened. And one thing that's kind of a remarkable thing that you find in the very old papers was that the unveiling there was a flag of France that was over the face of the statue, and Bartholdi was up in the crown, and he was supposed to pull the rope when it was actually officially handed over to the president. So Senator Everett is giving the speech. There's a lot of cacophony because the boats that are in the harbor are having so much fun. They're trying to act like roosters, and they're like sending off their cannons at the wrong time and things. And so but down giving the speech, Everett says, nothing would have happened if it weren't for the vision of this man, Bartholdi. And the crowd erupts in cheers. And Bartholdi, whether because he just thought he heard the signal or what have you, it was at that moment he drops the flag, and all the cannons go off on the shore and everywhere else. There's the guns firing, and it's so loud that no one can actually hear the speech where it is delivered to the president. But Bartholdi is hugging Butler and weeping in his arms. So, this is the, inner scaffold of the statue. And one of the interesting things is, for a brief period of time, the statue was the tallest structure. But very soon after, the person who designed that inner structure, which is Gustave Eiffel, decided to make the Eiffel Tower, which was taller than the Statue of Liberty. And what became of Bartholdi? Here he is with his friend Richard Butler. He died in 1904 of tuberculosis, and one of the things that had really, haunted him before he died was that he never felt that America truly thanked him enough for this work. He didn't really get paid. He had a genius idea early on, which was to keep the copyright for the image of the statue, and he thought, as he, the man would have been a zillionaire that every time it was used, he would get some money from that. It quickly spun out of control with every advertiser wanting to use it and it being replicated in postcards and everything else, and so he could not collect on that in the end. He was able to sell a few models that were smaller scale, and that provided some money. He still, even after the statue was erected, had to come to New York pitching his other sculpture ideas down here to Washington, carrying along his maquettes, and other artists thought this was just so humiliating that he would have to do that, not just get assignments. So, but the thing is, he was very thrilled at the fact the statue came out exactly how he thought it should look. He had ideas of what he wanted around the island, the kind of festivities he wanted there, but he thought that the statue was right. And he had this very loving relationship with his wife, who was someone he married sort of against the wishes of his mother. He wrote his mother a letter when he secretly wed this woman in America. She was French, but they wed in America. And he said, she is neither beautiful nor intelligent nor well off, but she has a great heart, and I love her. And she was, the sunshine in a sad room. And so later on, his wife would lament that they didn't have children, and he'd say, but what of our daughter Liberty? We have her together. So anyhow, I think that, overall, as crazy as this whole scheme was, it definitely seems as if it was the sort of thing that was important to do, because even now, we use this as a reminder of what we say we're supposed to stand for. So the fact that we can't duck it, that there's this massive woman representing liberty in our harbor, you can say, whenever there's some sort of controversy, this is our value. So I think, ultimately, it's the story of a success, right? So I would like to take questions if anyone has them, and they'd like it if you could come to the microphones. So. Yes.
Hi. So, not sure it's on, but I'll talk up.
It sounds good. It sounds good.
Okay. Is it on? All right. There is a story in the black community that the Statue of Liberty was originally going to be black. There's certainly the story, not just in the black community, that the origin of it shortly after the demolition of slavery by the Civil War has to do with liberty against slavery, and of course there are broken chains at the feet.
Yep.
Do you have any comments on those?
Yeah, there's a lot to that, actually. Because when it was going to be at the mouth of the Suez Canal, the idea was that the woman would be a fella, it would be a slave woman, and it was to represent the fact that the Egyptian Khedive had abolished slavery there. So it was not, it was originally a slavery, image there. When he was designing it in America, one of his inspirations he would cite later was that he was at a dinner party with some of the French intellectuals around 1865, in the summer of 1865. So it was just after the Civil War, just after the assassination of Lincoln, and they were talking about why the relationship between America and France would remain, whereas the relationship between France and, say, Italy always had to be, bought through land exchange and things like that. And they were saying that it's because of this common, belief in liberty. So they were talking, some of the people who were at that dinner party actually went on to use some of those ideas to actually create this commemoration to Lincoln and to the end of slavery, which was this gold coin. Bartholdi went away and thought of creating this statue that was liberty. And there are the chains were at one point in her hand in one of the models, and then they were tucked under the foot later. And actually, I think that had more to do with when, as time was going by and they weren't getting enough support, he was trying to make it time more toward 1876 and getting further away from the idea of noting the end of the Civil War.
So when it was going to be Egyptian, she might have been black or interracial?
Yeah, she looked, like an Egyptian. It wasn't Southern African, features, but yes, she was from African, let's say.
My son has a question.
Oh, yes.
Why is the Statue of Liberty green?
Very good question. And actually, you know, this is the amazing thing. The people who made the Statue of Liberty, for some reason, did not predict that it was going to turn green. In all of the accounts that I came across, they would talk about it turning a darker copper penny color, but it turned green, and they should have predicted it. It's because the copper, if it's in, you know, if it oxidizes, it creates this patina just naturally, and so that's that green color that you see. And so I don't know why they didn't think that it was going to happen, but in the end it turned out to be a good thing, because when they were trying to light the statue and it was just this dark copper color, nothing would reflect off of it. But the fact that it is this lighter green, along with, you know, a better generator, better, more sophisticated electrical systems, they are able to make it really glow in the New York Harbor. So if you took any copper thing, you know, that doesn't have another metal added in and put it outside, you'll see it'll turn that color as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So,
Oh, sorry. We'll do
okay,
father follow-up. Sorry.
So what did the U.S. do in return?
Not really much. I mean, no, nothing really. I mean, Pulitzer created a beautiful silver Tiffany object to give to Bartholdi himself, you know, as a thank you. But they didn't do anything really for France. I mean, there was a small model sent over of the statue to Paris, but it is quite small. It was just, in a way, you could say it's a little bit of American, you know, like, of course you'll give us this gift, and we thank you, you know. But yeah, not much else. I mean, we still could do it, right?
That's right. That's right. Well, thank you. I just had
you.
to have a question just in case my son was too shy.
Yeah, no, he did. He was great. He was great.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you.
How did
Yes.
they choose Liberty Island, and what's the timing vis-a-vis the opening of Ellis Island?
Well, so when Bartoli was coming over, he actually had it in mind, and it's in his diary, that he was going to scout locations, and he was going to scout Central Park, Prospect Park, and Battery Park as some of his ideas, which would have been a whole other idea. There is, you know, the Dakota building which is around Central Park, had not been built yet, but it was about to be. And if it had been created there, the big toe would have been where the roof was on the Dakota. So it would have been very odd. But he looked at those, and also he got a lot of wary feelings from, you know, the designers of Central Park, Olmsted and Vaux, and so he instead was looking at the little islands, and Bedloe Island, which is now Liberty Island, was one of the things that interested him. But there was a fort built there, and he talks about a mortifying afternoon. He goes out to talk to the general there, which again I think must have been a funny moment, that while he's talking to the general, and the general probably has no idea what this man has in mind, you know, that he's going to rip apart at the fort and put up this huge woman standing there. But anyhow, that's what it had been, and it was chosen by Bartholdi. And then when it went to Congress, there was a choice of 2 islands, and they went with Bartholdi's choice. Ellis Island, there was this, came later after the statue was created, but there was a discussion, should they make Liberty Island where they processed immigrants, and Bartholdi actually thought that would be an abomination, and it would, you know, a desecration of the site. So there was a big pushback, and it was not chosen as the site. But yes.
Did he have a relationship with Emma Lazarus, and how did the poem come to be there?
He personally did not have a relationship with Emma Lazarus, but this woman who was doing a fundraiser for the statue towards the later part of its, you know, near construction, she created this art exhibition that was, they didn't have the Met yet there, and so this was the biggest gathering of artwork in New York. And one of the things she did was to create a sort of literary journal that was going to have contributions from different writers, and Mark Twain contributed a very odd piece for that. And then Emma Lazarus was one of her friends, and she had already achieved some fame as having written poems for the refugees of the Russian pogroms. And she said, will you write a poem for liberty? And Emma Lazarus sort of, you know, poo-pooed it. She thought it was a sort of silly idea. about the statue. And then the woman said, but why don't you think about these refugees? So she went away and she came back with this poem, and people were immediately very moved by it and thought that it gave the statue meaning that the statue hadn't had before. But it sort of disappeared from view. It ran in the paper the next day, but then no one paid any attention. And it was only in, I think it's 1903, I'd have to check again, that it was actually put as a plaque on the statue, and that was by the friend funding it. And then it wasn't until much later in the 30s that a journalist from Croatia came across it and thought it was an interesting poem and brought it to more people's attention. But yeah, it's such an important part of the statue, but it was an afterthought, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, I actually had a chance to read the book. Well done. Feels very epic, not only on a personal level, but just as it relates to history at the time. What I actually found interesting was why he would continue to, over a period of maybe 10 years, do this without there was no financial gain. He had no commitments from the government whatsoever. No one was offering him any money. Was this just a mark of his tremendous ego, or was he really just trying to satisfy his own lust for fame, or?
Well, it's a good question. I think that basically when he was 2 years old, his mother wrote a letter to his uncle saying, I see in the seeds of this child the marks of a great man, but he has this tremendous will, and it's going to be a challenge for me to curb that will without crushing it. So I think, he was probably born with this kind of drive and bit of an adventurous spirit. It is amazing for anyone who's ever created anything that he never had moments of self-doubt. I mean, I've read through all of his letters. There's never a moment where he thinks, well, you know what, this might not be the best design or something like that. Or, maybe it's not the right time. He just is convinced it has to happen. And I think that it had to do with the spirit of the day, too, which is where people were coming up with all kinds of crazy notions and wanting to see them through. And it was partly just to impress their fellow humans. They wanted to create the biggest, suspension bridge. They wanted to create, the inventions that were going to change everyone's life overnight. And it wasn't for necessarily monetary gain. It was just because that would show what was possible. So I think he was operating in that spirit. And so so he was, and also there was just, this idea that liberty, which had been so hard fought for in France and had been, so much blood had been shed for it, that it had been established in America, that France had helped America so at such a key moment to make that happen. And I think that was something that he wanted to celebrate as a man who had lost his actual homeland in, Colmar being given away and, had watched all these other troubles. So I think it was that sort of thing. Yes.
Is the mic still on?
Yeah.
It seems to me in the age that we're talking about, when I guess the World Fair was something that people could make something so wonderful and so huge and so dramatic, and it doesn't seem like today in this era of internet, Facebook, Twitter, whatever, that anything could strike the imagination, such as like the building of a colossus. I mean, do you think like in today's time, something like this somebody would come and build a big statue and everyone would flock to see it?
Well, I have to say that part of my motivation in writing the book is that I kind of hope people will think that way. I mean, I think that, we certainly don't want 5 billion colossi around the landscape, but I think thinking in those terms is very important for a society. And so the idea that you would use all your talents to create something great for other people, I mean, he was not actually trying to make a fortune off of this, is a wonderful enterprise. So I think there's probably people out there, and hopefully there's people in the generations to come that are out there like that, but it would be nice if it was encouraged more in the society. Yes.
I'm just wondering, you talked about the financial struggle and the political struggle to get it, but did he have technical struggles to build something so big?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's things in the book that are, there's a whole things in the book where he actually doesn't even, when he's created the statue, he doesn't even know how it's going to stand up. And he had this engineer who was supposed to be the greatest engineer, alive, and then suddenly that man was dead. He had left no plans. And so when he had enough money to actually create the interior structure, he had no idea what it would look like. So he went to Gustav Eiffel, who had created the most astounding bridges, and he said, will you help me with this? And Eiffel said, I'll do it, but only in very rigid, time and money constraints. And so he came up with that interior scaffold. But even with that in place, when it came to America, they said, well, that's a wonderful thing, but how is it not going to just blow over the first time, a storm hits this? So then the engineer Stone was trying to come up with every possible way to brace it too. And so, at that point, they thought, well, you'll have to upend the whole island if it's going to topple over, because it was braced so well. But even, the copper, when they brought it over, they had spent so much time hammering it into those shapes. It sat out in the sun because they had no money to build a protecting, enclosure, and some of them melted out of shape and had to be re-hammered together. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And in fact, you know what? The statue is not even complete right now, because there's all of these things and the stone that are supposed to, you'll see them if you go, that are discs and plaques and things. The discs were supposed to have all of the states, and at that time it was 40 states. So in a way, it's a good thing they never did that, because then we'd be putting 10 more somewhere. But those were supposed to be carved. They were supposed to be plaques that said things about France and America. Those never happened. When it first was over there, they didn't even have enough rivets to do all the holes before it went up. So it goes on and on. But it's very funny too, because his reaction to all of these things as they're unfolding is, and he even said when it was unveiled that night, he said, for 15 years I've had a headache, and this is finally, broken it open. So, yes, I think I have one more.
Okay, I have a question about Bartholdi's diary.
Yes.
Had it been translated? How did it get to the New York Public Library? Had it been translated, and is it digitized? Okay,
it is not digitized, but or at least it wasn't when, maybe it has been in the last year. But the beautiful thing is, and this is, if anyone out there is a translator, I bless you, because the Rodman Gilder, who's long deceased, had translated those diaries, and if I had not seen them first in translation, I probably never would have been inspired to do this, because it was just, I was scanning through. When I went over to France, of course, nothing's translated, and so I was doing my own translations along with the help of some other people. But so all it is it's a very beautiful little diary in which he's doing sketches and writing in tiny script, but this man did an incredible translation, and so that was what sort of, made it accessible. I mean, I think that's just an incredible gift that the man went and did this for the archives. So, I think, do I, one more? Okay. One more question.
There's a piece of Bartholdi's sculpture in Washington.
Yes.
And can you tell us a little bit about that?
It's the Bartholdi Fountain, which is just out, just in front of the Capitol building in the Bartholdi Garden. I didn't realize that was Bartholdi Park, I guess they call it. So actually, that fountain he made for that expo, the Philly Expo, and his idea was he would bring it to America, and it would be a fundraising thing. He would sell it to some town or city, and that would be money used to help make the rest of Liberty. But when he brought down, there were no takers whatsoever, and he had this moment of thinking, and now I have to ship it back there. Oh, what do I do? So eventually, luckily within a year, he had a buyer, and DC was taking it, and so it came down here and then was later moved. But that had the original problem of the copper and the iron pressing together, which he also had with Liberty, and that was a big reason why they had to do the reworking of Liberty later. But that not only is a problem of corrosion, but it also can create a battery of, as they said about Liberty, of unknown proportions. And so there was this worry that because of how it was riveted with these two metals meeting, and then the salt in the air, that Liberty would get become this electrically charged thing. So they put little rags soaked with different substances in between each rivet to stop that. But anyhow, it had the same thing. But that fountain's holding up very well. Looks good now. I think that's all I have time for. But thank you again. Thank you so much.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.